we could spend a lot of time talking about all the challenges that Haiti faces, and they are very real. But I think that what I saw was extraordinary examples of courage, integrity, commitment, and care that just gives me faith in humankind.
Hello, and welcome. I'm Elias Primoff, and on today's episode, we're taking a closer look at Haiti through a humanitarian lens. Haiti is facing a deepening humanitarian crisis, one that hasn't gotten nearly the attention it deserves. In the capital, Port-au-Prince, violence between armed groups and the police has intensified, spilling into residential neighborhoods and putting civilians in harm's way. At the same time, the already fragile healthcare system is being pushed to the brink. This didn't happen overnight. Years of political instability, poverty, and repeated emergencies have left communities extremely vulnerable, and the current violence is only making things worse. Today we'll talk about what this means for people trying to access healthcare, and how our medical humanitarian teams are continuing to respond, even as insecurity makes their work more dangerous and more difficult. To help us understand what it takes to deliver medical care in this environment, I'm joined by Tirana Hassan, CEO of Doctors Without Borders USA, who was recently in Haiti, meeting with our staff and hearing directly from patients. Tirana, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, Tirana, Haiti was your first project visit as CEO of Doctors Without Borders USA. Why was it important for you to go there personally?
I mean, there are two things. One is that I felt it was really important as I took this role to connect with our projects and our work. And Haiti is one of our oldest projects, but it's also very close to the US. And, you know, there's a lot of connection between Haiti and the US. The projects in Haiti are huge. Actually, MSF is one of the, most significant providers of healthcare in Haiti, and particularly around providing sexual violence support, both medical and psychological support to survivors of sexual violence.
That's a good point that I want to come back to later about our kind of special connection here in the U.S. To Haiti and to the Haitian diaspora as well. But going back to your visit to Haiti, your arrival there, you flew into Port-au-Prince?
It sounds like that's an easy thing to do, Elias, but it's a lot more complicated. Because of the insecurity, the airport is actually closed in Port-au-Prince, which is Haiti's capital. So you arrive actually in the north of the country, in Cap-Haïtien. So we have a MSF, or Doctors Without Borders. I'm going to say MSF, which is obviously, as you know, our acronym in French. But we have a base in the north of the country, in Cap-Haïtien, and that's really our hub to be able to coordinate all of the staff and the logistics that pass through the country. That's where you wait for a helicopter, which is run by the UN, and depending on the weather and if the stars align, that helicopter will arrive on time, and then it's a quick helicopter ride into the capital.
What was your impression coming in from Cap-Haïtien on a helicopter, arriving in Port-au-Prince? What did you see?
Cap-Haïtien to Port-au-Prince is a very short ride, and you cover a lot of the country, and you can see that there's an abundance. There's so much potential in Haiti, and it's really being dampened and curbed by the insecurity that we were talking about. And people are beginning to, or have been for a while, consolidating in Port-au-Prince, because that's the area that you are most likely able to get services and things are functioning. Increasingly, we are seeing people moving out of the city because of insecurity. But when you approach Port-au-Prince, you are really struck, or at least I was really struck, by how densely populated it is. You look down and you see how close together, all of the houses and the shelters are once you get into that city area. And then once you get into the MSF projects, you see what that means for people in real life, because a lot of the people in Port-au-Prince, the residents, are living in areas which are controlled by armed groups, and they're often displaced.
Right.
And that displacement means that you'll move from your house to some sort of temporary living situation, and that temporary living situation is often just a room in an abandoned school or an abandoned building. An entire family can be living there. When you connect those two and you look at it from the air, you can feel that pressure that the community, our patients, are living through.
Once you arrived and you made your way to an MSF project, what were you seeing?
Actually, I'm glad you asked the question, because it is quite striking. Where we have our base, where our offices are, where we do a lot of the coordination and administration work, that's an area of Port-au-Prince which is relatively safe. Right. It's very safe, and life goes on as normal. I remember vividly seeing the things that you would expect to see: people dropping their kids to work, sitting in traffic jams, the chaos of gridlock, people on their way to work. And then slowly, as you get to the areas where our clinics and our hospitals are, often areas which are more insecure and prone to outbreaks of violence between security forces and the armed groups, things start to peter out. So you go from this intensity of watching life to slowly it just diminishing. Fewer people on the street, fewer businesses are open, and because there have been skirmishes in those areas before, some of the roads will actually be blocked. They'll either be blocked by rocks and by, I saw tires on the street, and you really get a sense that, you have entered a different kind of area. It's a little bit eerie.
Yeah. Haiti is so geographically close to the United States. But conversely, for a lot of Americans, I think they hear about Haiti, they hear about what's going on there, and even though it has this proximity, it still sometimes feels very far away. From your perspective, why is Haiti such a critical place for Doctors Without Borders to be working right now?
Well, the Doctors Without Borders projects in Haiti have existed for a very long time. So we have a really, strong connection to the country that predates the earthquake even. But it's the same reason that we work in a lot of places. This is where the needs are. There are very few basic services when it comes to healthcare which are available to the general population. And in Haiti, there isn't a sanitation system that is functioning currently. So the garbage piles up in front of the maternity hospital that MSF runs. This is in an area that is controlled by armed groups. And as a result, very few services exist. You don't have access to clean water. The rubbish that has been accumulating for years has now actually reached the height of our outer perimeter fence. We know from the type of illnesses that are coming into our clinics that those poor conditions actually translate into real health consequences. I went to a mobile clinic that we run, and that is run once a week, and it's an extraordinary operation. It's a 4-car convoy that goes down into an area that is controlled by the armed groups. Our colleagues have essentially packed a mini clinic that they can get out of the car and into a church that we use in 40 minutes and set it up. The cases that were coming in, and people flooded in. There was, a couple of hundred people sitting in the pews of the church in where the team was doing their triage, and that's deciding, allocating people where to go and which services that they need. There was a lot of people in one corner, and I asked one of our colleagues, and what's happening to these people? And they said, well, these are all the people that are just coming to access soap and treatment for scabies. Because there's no access to clean water, because people are living in these crowded conditions in sort of displaced encampments, so to speak, they end up having a lot of skin conditions and other health consequences. And it's without having an MSF mobile clinic that goes to that area, they would never have access to any kind of medical care.
We think about this a lot. We talk about this a lot as MSF. We work often in conflict settings where people are at risk of injury or death because of violence, right? But I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand the depth and the breadth of the effects of conflict on everyday life, right? So we talked earlier about the airport being closed on and off, but the impact of insecurity and violence on infrastructure, on basic services, on things as simple as water and sanitation are really dire and something that I think a lot of people don't consider. Another aspect of conflict that MSF teams often respond to is sexual violence. And I know that our teams have noted growing rates of sexual violence in Port-au-Prince. And you visited MSF's Pran Men'm clinic in Port-au-Prince during your visit, which is one of very few places in Haiti that survivors can receive comprehensive treatment. Why is it so important for MSF to be providing this kind of care in Haiti? And what was your experience visiting that project?
I'm really glad you asked. For survivors of sexual violence in Haiti, there are very few services that are available. We recently, did an analysis of, what we've been seeing when it comes to sexual violence, and not only are more people coming, very disturbing results patterns were beginning to emerge, including the fact that there were more often than not more than one perpetrator. On average, there were 3 perpetrators involved in an assault. And also another very disturbing trend was that this was not, sexual violence wasn't just being perpetrated against young women and girls, although they do make up the vast majority of our patients. But increasingly, we're seeing older women between 50 and above and 80 now, being targeted and surviving sexual violence. For the project of Pran Men'm, that clinic was incredibly unique. It's not like anything I have seen in 2 decades of doing this work and working specifically with survivors of sexual violence. And the thing that made it very special was it's 24 hours. 24 hours in a context like Port-au-Prince is incredibly important, because one of the things that we heard from survivors was that they struggled to actually get to our facilities. And when it came to survivors of sexual violence, it was even harder because they were often living in the same neighborhoods as the perpetrator. And that meant sometimes that if the perpetrator was a person who was arming a checkpoint that they had to pass every day, survivors were hesitant to want to cross that checkpoint to be able to get to our clinic. And so they would come at all times of the day and night. And in particular, the project coordinator of Pran Men'm was telling me about one day where a group of girls, all who had been survivors of attacks of sexual violence, had actually banded together because it was safer and more discreet for them to look like they were just going out to do something as a group of young girls. But actually what they were doing was they were sort of creating that sort of image so that they could pass easily without suspicion. And they all arrived at our clinic at exactly the same time, and we were able to provide those services. Pran Men'm is comprehensive care. So that's really quite unique. Survivors can arrive, get the medical treatment that they need, but they're also able to access social workers and psychologists who are able to provide and assist in the healing process beyond the injuries that they may have faced. So we have this inpatient clinic that essentially means that survivors can arrive, get the service they need, and then there is an outpatient clinic. So for patients who needing to have follow-up care, also they can go there for any sort of sexual reproductive health needs that they may have. And then there's a third service that is run out of the Pran Men'm clinic, and that is really something I hadn't seen before, and that is a 24-hour hotline for survivors. Now, even though our clinic is in Port-au-Prince, a survivor can call from anywhere in the country, and there is going to be a qualified midwife or one of our staff, MSF staff, who is going to be at the end of that phone and be able to talk to that survivor and make a referral even if they're not in the capital. One of the challenges we face, though, is because of the current situation in Haiti, there's very few places to refer our patients if they need to be able to find emergency accommodation so that they don't have to go back to being proximate to perpetrators. We do have some fantastic partners in Haiti that we are able to make referrals to, but the numbers just are greater than the resources.
And I think it's also worth noting here that the majority of the people who are staffing these projects are Haitian themselves and often from the communities where they're working, which I think adds an important dimension to making sure that we're meeting people where they are and giving them the care that they need.
Our Haitian colleagues are, living in communities which are affected by these escalations in violence. Many of them have also been displaced. So the realities of working in a conflict and living in a conflict is acute for our colleagues, and every day they continue to show up. One of the things that I took away from this trip was the time that I spent with our Haitian colleagues, particularly actually in the Tabarre Hospital, which is a particularly special project that MSF runs. It is the only burns center in all of Haiti. So not just in the capital, but in the entire country. And I had the opportunity to actually go through the hospital, speak to patients, and talk about the work with our Haitian colleagues. And it was really extraordinary. The Tabarre Hospital is a trauma hospital. So we treat trauma cases, but what particularly struck me was the burns unit. I mean, first and foremost, I can tell you that every bed was full. Because it is the only service that's available. But I was speaking to one of our patients who had very serious burns all over his body. He was working in a bakery. He was attaching a gas tank, changing the tubes on a gas cylinder, and it exploded. And he had been in Tabarre for months. What he talked about was not just the quality of care and the fact that he would not have survived if he had not been brought to the MSF hospital, but spending that length of time, he talked about how important it was to have the relationships with our staff. He said, one of the things that I appreciate so much about being here is the doctors sit with me every day. The staff are wonderful. And that's the quality of care piece, right? The quality of care that our colleagues are providing is not just about the highest quality medical care. It's not about just providing the physiotherapy to help him be able to move his joints and be able to rehabilitate and leave the hospital and go back home. But there is a lot of psychological healing that has to happen as well. And that hospital has, both in the outreach and the inpatient services, social workers and psychologists that are available to provide that service throughout the healing journey. But we also have community health workers who basically play a liaison role as well. So I had the opportunity to sit and meet with a group of our community health workers who do this liaison work, and they are the people who are able to identify patients that might need to be referred to the hospital. They're also able to give us information about the conditions, the security situation, how the population and the community is being affected by escalations in violence, for example. They're also able to tell us when there are disruptions in water delivery because there's not access to clean water in many of the areas where we work. those teams play a really critical role, I think, in a number of ways. They build trust with the community. They help us make sure that we're tailoring our services to meet the needs of the community. And they're able to tell people what's available because not everybody will know.
Right. Here in the U.S., Haiti is often discussed through the lens of migration, and those who are following the news may be aware that there's a current legal challenge to what is called temporary protected status for Haitian people living in the U.S. I think, based on what you saw on the ground, it's important for audiences here in the U.S. to understand what is the reality people are facing inside Haiti today. What are they up against, and what are the causes that are leading them to travel to places like the United States, and why is temporary protected status important?
To cancel temporary protection status from one day to the next would mean essentially that 350,000 people would have to move back to Haiti. And the assumption is that Haiti is safe and functioning and they can return. I think that is a reality that everybody wants to see, but is not the reality on the ground. What we have seen in the years that we have been there, and particularly in the last few years, is that insecurity, particularly in Port-au-Prince and the capital, is pervasive. It's quite often the statistic that's quite often stated is that 80% of the capital is controlled by armed groups. There is not a justification that feels reasonable from what we have seen as Doctors Without Borders to make the assertion that Haiti is a safe place for people to return. As I was saying before, there isn't the basic services that are available to the population. What is available is already taxed, and sending back 350,000 people will only put more pressure on that. And then there is just the reality of the violence. So there are bouts of insecurity where there is shooting, there is fighting between armed groups and security forces. People are often injured during those. There's a lot of what is referred to as balles perdues, which is stray bullets, basically, because where the skirmishes take place are in very densely populated areas. And so there are people everywhere. We have high levels of sexual violence, and then there's the issue of displacement. So take all of that together. That is the reality that a lot of people in places like Port-au-Prince are living through on a daily basis. It's a difficult case to make that Haiti is currently safe enough for people to return.
This was your first visit to an MSF project as CEO of MSF, Doctors Without Borders USA. I'm curious to hear what has stayed with you the most about this experience, not just as CEO, but as a human being.
Well, I'm both a CEO and a human being at the same time, so it'll be an easy question to answer. But I was so proud to work for MSF when I looked at the projects. I think the work that we are doing in Haiti is MSF at its best. There is great need with the level of care and the quality of care that is being provided, everything from the trauma hospitals through to the sexual violence clinics are really of a standard that is exceptional. And I was really heartened by that. But also I was really heartened by the resilience and the care, the resilience of the patients that we spoke to, and the resilience of our colleagues who are working in incredibly difficult circumstances. We could spend a lot of time talking about all the challenges that Haiti faces, and they are very real. But I think that what I saw was extraordinary examples of courage, integrity, commitment, and care that just gives me faith in humankind.
Tirana, thanks so much for joining us today and for sharing your experiences. You, I think, provided a lot of really important depth and nuance and detail. And I know that, for supporters, for people who follow MSF's work, understanding intellectually that this work is happening is important and is often meaningful. But I also know that anybody who has seen an MSF project in action is moved and really understands the impact and the power of this work. So being able to hear it from you firsthand is a great opportunity. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for listening. If you found this conversation insightful, please consider subscribing and leaving a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. It really helps more people find and engage with our humanitarian work. To learn more about the work Doctors Without Borders is doing in Haiti and how we continue to respond to emergencies around the world, you can visit doctorswithoutborders.org. This is the Humanitarian Lens, a podcast from Doctors Without Borders USA. Until next time.